Matt, thank you very much and for bringing, in addition to the other discussions, more about the trade union perspective as well on the Remain vote. So thank you very much. Unfortunately, our final speaker today, Steve Headley, the Assistant General Secretary of the RMT, hasn't been able to make it. The RMT are about to go on strike in Scotland. So he's had to go up to Scotland to do some, really important work there. So I think we send solidarity greetings to the RMT and the fight that they've got, yet another fight they've got, and industrial action. So thank you very much. So we have got about 20 minutes, and I'd like to open it up now to discussion, debate, questions. If you have a question that's specifically for somebody, can you say who it's for? If you want to make contributions as well, that's absolutely fine. But contributions, can you try? There are trade unionists in this room. No conference speeches, please, today. Because I don't have a red light to turn you off. So please, be respectful that everybody wants to have their say. So I've seen Dave Proctor, Dave Stavris. I can't remember where I went. Comrade here. Comrade at the back. Yes. Yeah, sister here. Okay, and then I'm seeing Mark and Joe. Okay, I'm going to try and remember that lot. I've written those down. So, starting off, Dave Proctor.
Thanks, Tracy. Just a couple of points. One's on workers' rights. And I keep hearing this argument from trade unionists. And it's not up to Europe to protect workers' rights, it's up to us as trade unions to protect workers' rights. And I don't know of one collective right that trade unions have got from Europe. I know plenty of individual rights, but to me that undermines the collective. As far as manufacturing is concerned, I'm an ex-miner. We've now got no mining industry left in Britain. We've got very little steel industry left in Britain. We've got very little car industry or shipbuilding left in Britain. Now all these are closed under a European Union. So I'd like to know how the European Union is going to protect manufacturing when we've seen all these manufacturing industries go under the European Union.
Thank you. Okay, take them in threes, I think, so if that's okay. Dave.
Yeah, thank you. I'm a supporter of the left exit campaign, and approaching this question from a class point of view, from the workers' point of view, I can see that it's a tactical question for the working class in Britain. It's not something fundamental, constitutional, something for all time. It's a question of which is simply better for the working class in or out of the EU. And I've listened very carefully to the arguments of Lucy. I think she must be the sixth MEP I've listened to in the last 3 weeks, which is great, and that they're doing a very good job in the circumstances they're in. But I've got two questions really for the people who support Remain, and they revolve around, first of all, the question of workers' rights, and secondly, the finance. On the workers' rights, all the social and employment rights that are written into various EU directives are true. But in practice, is it not the case that when any of these have come counter to the fundamental right of capital to do as it wishes, which is one of the fundamental freedoms under the treaties, that it is in fact the capitalists who are always paramount? There have been 4 European Court of Justice rulings, and they're called Viking, Laval, Ruffert and Luxembourg. And they were when capitalists moved services or trade or contracts from one country to another and tried to use the cheapest costs of labour from one country to operate in another. I won't go into all the details because they're quite complicated. But the effect, the series of judgment meant that whatever it says in the EU's rights of workers, they were overruled by the fundamental rights of capital. The Viking and Laval judgments barred trade unionists from using collective action to enforce collective bargaining, national wages, that sort of thing. The Ruffert and the Luxembourg judgments barred regional and national governments from requiring the payment of locally electively bargained wage rights. So we can see that whenever, under the freedom of it is the freedom of capital which is ruled in favour of by the European Court of Justice. Now, very briefly on finance, it hasn't been mentioned. Britain isn't in the Eurozone, so we've not yet been subject to the same strictures as the countries that are. But the European Treaty for Stability, Coordination and Governance is one question that has not been addressed by the Remaining camp. This started in 2011 to 12, ratified in 2013. It requires all countries to submit their budgets to the EU to make sure that they comply with economic governance regulations. Britain has to submit its national reform programme under the EU 2020 programme to ensure that its deficit is reduced in line with EU guidelines. It is barred under the treaty from allowing the Bank of England to buy government bonds, for example.
Dave, do you want to make your point? Because we've got lots of other people.
I want to know how the Remain camp answer this. And the EU seeks to squeeze down every aspect of public spending. It actually overturned recently the Scottish government's Scottish Futures Trust under the rules about public sector funding paying for infrastructure projects. I'd like to know how the Remain camp answer the fact that the EU is moving towards a corporate neoliberal superstate which overrules any workers' rights that exist on paper. Thank you.
Thank you. And then in this round, finally, comrade there with the blue shirt.
Yeah, I heard what Joseph said, and I certainly agree when he says that after the referendum, what unites us is more important than what divides us. But what I didn't understand was how all the criticisms that he makes of the EU will be improved by Britain leaving. For the period that the EU's existed, it has increasingly brought about an integrated European economy in particular sectors. For example, here in Oxford, the motor industry is organised on a Europe-wide basis, and I know that Unite stewards at the motorworks are worried about the future of investment if a company that has plants in several countries in Europe won't know for 2 or 3 years whether the cars produced in Oxford will have their existing access to the rest of the European market. Clearly they're not going to be putting the investment in Oxford until the situation is clarified. Another major employer here is scientific research, which is increasingly organised on a Europe-wide basis. And in fact, Britain gets a disproportionate amount of European funding for that, which is in fact the only public sector money going into scientific research, university research in this country, and this is a serious sector of the economy that's organised on a Europe-wide basis. And so I don't see how you can avoid a tremendous cost to working people by attempting to wrench the British-based sectors of the European economy out of that framework. If that was the overhead cost that had to be paid for an advance in working class struggle, then that would be another matter. Of course, every advance in working class struggle, whether it's a strike, the election of a left government, mass riots, is bad for business confidence. That's the price well worth paying for that advance. But this referendum is not moved and brought about by an advance in class struggle. It's not because mass awareness of the capitalist nature of the EU became a mass movement and compelled a referendum. It's the internal squabble in the Tory party. And in fact, I think the crisis for David Cameron, if anything, would be greater if there was a narrow Remain vote, because the Brexiteers would be absolutely apeshit and his head would be even more on a block. And on the question of workers, so it seems to me that that fight has to be a Europe-wide fight. And at the end of the day, like all fights in capitalist state structures, whether national or European, it will be determined by the relationship of forces, not by the letter of treaties and laws. Which, one last point on the question of workers' rights. It's absolutely true that workers' rights in law are not handed to us from above by the European Union or by national states. This isn't only true of European legal rights, it's true of all legal rights that were granted by Parliament. They weren't granted by the goodwill of Parliament. But that doesn't mean that we're neutral if somebody suggests taking them away. I can actually remember before there was a legal national minimum wage, some people actually said, oh, we don't need a national minimum wage, it will become a maximum wage, the way you get up low pay is by struggle at the point of production, all of which is true, but it reinforced that struggle to have it written down. Now, of course, those European provisions are minimal. In some countries, like France, they're way in advance of the European minimum. They have fantastic workers' rights in France, which is why the European Union is certainly not preventing the French government from forcing them down. We're in a different position. So I think that we really have to ask what the context is of this referendum. A left government could defy the European Union, it wouldn't have to hold another plebiscite if it wanted to, it could repeal the European Communities Act, it could do all sorts of things, hopefully in cooperation with others. But this referendum is a Tory referendum for a Tory Brexit, and I can't see any benefit to working class people or to the Labour movement coming out of a victory for Brexit.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to now ask the impossible, which is brief responses to those. I mean, they don't go together, do they, those 2 points? But can I ask, in the order that you spoke, for you just to make some brief responses to those questions, if that's okay? And we'll try then and get one more round in before we need to break. Thank you. So over to you, Lucy.
Thank you. Well, firstly, to Dave Proctor, who made the point that others have also made, that it is up to us to protect workers' rights. I absolutely agree with that, but one of the ways that we can do that most effectively is campaigning and lobbying and fighting and voting for European-wide standards. And that goes together, as was said, with the struggle that needs to happen in workplaces and up and down the land. And actually, I would take issue with one thing that Joseph said, which is that the European Parliament is toothless. I can absolutely assure you I would not be wasting my time going there if it was toothless. It is true that in the old days, when it was first set up, it was simply not much more than a consultation forum. But these days, although technically we can't propose legislation, we have the power of veto over many appointments. We can table amendments, we can reject proposals, and frequently do at both first reading and second reading stage. And I have to say that a lot of there's been massive opposition to TTIP all across Europe, but quite a lot of that has come from and been supported by people within the Parliament working across political groups with citizens' petitions in order to ensure that the Commission are told very firmly this is not the TTIP deal that we want. And what is absolutely true is if we left the European Union, even if TTIP goes through in whatever form, and as things currently stand, it doesn't look like it's going to go through. But even if we left, the absolutely first government to sign up to a terrible deal with the Americans would be the Tory government, either the current one or one led by Boris Johnson, which would have no protection for workers' rights, environmental issues, consumer standards, food standards, and all the rest of it. So I don't find the TTIP argument convincing at all. And also, Dave, you talked about the industrial issues. Yes, it's true that we're working in a broader capitalist framework, and as was said, it's a product of the neoliberal governments that we do have. So we need to work to change those governments and then have a European cooperation framework as well. And that would include on a productive strategy for industry within the interests of the working class and in the interests of training, investment, collective bargaining and the rest of it. And yes, Lexit is a tactical question, which is absolutely right. The last colleague who spoke, it is a tactical question, which is why it would be crazy for us to fall into the trap and go ahead and do that and say, well, actually we should just leave because it's in our interest to leave, when in fact it very clearly isn't. Some of the details of the European directives in practice and the fundamental right of capital, and are all the cases backing up capital. Well, Michael Ford's report that I mentioned is really interesting on this. It is true that some of those cases are incredibly unhelpful, but over time, the European Court of Justice, I think if you look at it systematically, has been moving much more towards protecting workers' rights more recently. There's a Polish case which protected the right for Polish workers to collectively bargain their terms and conditions. There's been new European Union public procurement legislation, and incidentally, it was always a myth in the past when we were told you can't stop, you have to contract that out because the European Union tells you, and you have to downgrade the workers' terms and conditions because the European Union tells you. That's not true. That comes a lot from the policies of Tory and to some extent Labour governments. The new procurement legislation makes it absolutely crystal clear you can prioritise social issues, including living wage issues, in what you do. Some of the problems that happened with those cases were to do with the fact that the local authorities concerned hadn't done it in the right way, and therefore it made it harder to defend when it came to the litigation strategy. And yes, we will have to. You were right about this. Of course, we can renationalise rail. We can renationalise whatever we want. But yes, we will face battles, but we can win those battles, and we will face litigation battles at UK level as well as EU level. And
we've only got 5 minutes
yeah,
left.
so I will just finish. So I won't deal with the finance issues, but there are so many. So hopefully Matt will deal with those as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Joseph.
Yeah, I mean, briefly on TTIP, I mean, Obama made it fairly clear when he came to Britain, his exact phrase was that if Britain wants a trade deal with America, if it's outside the EU, it'll have to join the back of the queue. So I don't think it's true that there will immediately be a trade deal between Britain and America. I know British people supposedly love queuing, but that's a queue I'd quite like to be at the back of, really. Secondly, I want to talk about this question of European-wide restructuring of capital, because you talk about the restructuring of capital in the car industry around Europe as if it's been a brilliant thing for workers, that there's been this free market created in which the industry has been restructured, and in which millions of people have lost their jobs as part of that process. I don't think it's automatically true that creating a free trade area, a bigger playground for capital, is in the interest of working class people. And I think there's a wider issue here, which is the question of, do we see a commonality of interest between workers and bosses? Or do we see an intrinsic antagonism between workers and bosses? It's very, very interesting. If you look at this EU referendum, I would say the capitalist class, although there are divisions, is more united over Britain staying in the EU than it was at the time of the last referendum in the 1970s. 2/3 of British multinationals, almost every European multinational, every major global bank in the world, the IMF, the CBI, the Institute of Directors, the Chamber of Commerce, the Cornish Pasty Makers Association, I found out recently, they all back a stay vote. Why is it? Are these organisations friends of workers? Or is there a basic antagonism of interest between them and us? And if there is, should we ask why there's been such a shift towards a stay camp from within big capitalist institutions? On that point, you see, people say, but if we leave, we'll still be a capitalist society, we'll still be neoliberal. All this is true. Also applies to the International Monetary Fund. Also applies to the World Trade Organization. The position of the left has never been, you break up the International Monetary Fund and capitalism ends. The position has always been that these are a set of institutions that help to drive through neoliberal counter-reforms, and we should break them up as part of a wider project of defeating capitalism and introducing socialism. It's part of a package of struggle. It's not an end in itself. But you can make exactly the same argument for any of these institutions, even NATO. You can put an argument, it's better to be in than out, let's stay and reform NATO. No one on the left makes this argument, but over the EU we seem to be completely blind to the neoliberal character of the thing. Final point, it's on the question of labour laws. You see, it's true of any free trade area that there will be a common set of labour regulations across it. That's true of all free trade areas, for obvious reasons. But ask yourself this question. Is it true that the European Union at the moment is responding from pressure from below, from workers' struggles, and introducing progressive legislation? Is that true in France? No. The EU's on the other side in France. It's joining the attack on workers' rights. Is it true in Greece, where collective agreements in industry are being shattered under the heel of the Troika? Absolutely not. There have been massive labour struggles in Greece, but those labour struggles have been conducted against the European Union and in the face of opposition from the European Union. We should be clear on where the European Union puts its weight in terms of those battles. It's not on the side of workers, it's on the side of bosses.
Thank you. And Matt, is there anything that you want to add?
Just quickly on the finance point, I think ignores again the role of British governments in driving neoliberalism. For example, the so-called independence of the Bank of England was not created by the EU, it's driven by British government decisions. That gives neoliberal constraints to financial decisions within Britain, with decisions made by British government. What I think is missed in all of this, all of these, whether it's the financial decisions, the legal decisions, the battle for workers' rights, they're an area of battle. They're areas of struggle. There's no, the idea that because this was created by a capitalist institution, we just reject that and actually leave. We have to battle on every single front. I have to say, it's from what Josie said, it just strikes me that the idea that what this ultimately comes down to is you turn the clock back, because ultimately, however much it is dressed up in left language, you believe that there is some sort of national solution to all these problems, and there isn't. The system we live in is a worldwide system. The EU is a sort of flawed attempt, not by us, by other people, to come to terms with that internationalisation. And there isn't, but the crisis that happened in 2007-2008 was an international crisis. We need international solutions to it, and actually leaving will, whatever people say, I think, will create obstacles between workers' unity, because apart from anything else, and I've got no illusions in what the trade unions have done, and we've been pretty feeble, to be honest, but it will create in the minds of workers in Britain and workers in France. The workers in France will say, the British have decided that they want a British solution to this issue, and actually British workers will believe increasingly that we have decided there is a British solution to this problem, and actually exit will not do anything to improve internationalism, which actually is essential to try and move forward on these issues.